Welcome to episode 239 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Sara Singer about 5 things she's learned as a white teacher working at a school in a predominantly Black community. You can visit truthforteachers.com to get an easy-to-read, easy-to-share blog post version of this podcast episode. And you'll get a sneak peek at our new Truth for Teachers Writers Collective that's launching soon. Teachers, if you're looking for engaging project-based lessons for students in grades K-12, I encourage you to take a look at the PBL tools and resources on Defined Learning. Defined Learning provides an online library of engaging real-world projects, along with inspiring career-focused videos, research resources, and more to help you create deeper learning opportunities for your students. Listeners of this podcast can get a free 60-day access to all of Defined Learning's PBL resources. Just go to definedlearning.com/truth. That's definedlearning.com/truth. This school year has turned out to be, dare I say, unprecedented in its challenges. I think we're all tired of that word, but it's certainly true. If your coworkers are burning out and overwhelmed, and your administrators feel helpless to do anything about it, let them know about the 40-hour leadership program. It's a new offshoot of my 40-hour teacher workweek program that's designed to create change at the school level, so everyone in the building can stay focused on what really makes a difference for kids and streamline or eliminate the rest. 40-hour leadership can be joined at any time. It's an entirely self-paced program for administrators, and it only requires an upfront time investment of around 8 to 10 hours for reimagining systems and simplifying processes. The idea is that you'll be able to save everyone in your school building time and energy every single day. We can work with your school to acquire grant funding and use professional development money to cover the cost via purchase order. We also offer additional consulting packages for personalized coaching and support. Just go to 40htw.com to learn more about the 40-hour leadership program and our other 40-hour resources designed to help teachers, instructional coaches, and admins find a sustainable way of doing a great job for kids. That's 40htw.com. So in today's episode, I'm talking with Sara Singer. She is a high school special education teacher on Chicago's South Side. Sara loves to co-teach and support students with disabilities in the general education classroom. She is also passionate about equity and creating rigorous, student-centered curricula. Sara's a writer for the Truth for Teachers Collective, and her first article is tackling a pretty tricky subject. What happens when you, as a teacher, are of a different race, ethnicity, or cultural background than your students? So Sara's white, specifically she's Jewish in her heritage, and her student population is almost 100% Black. When she submitted her pitch to write about this topic, I was a little hesitant because there's a lot that can go wrong. I told Sara my concern that I wanted to make sure we were not speaking for people of color or talking about what they need from us on their behalf. She totally got that and shared that same concern. And we moved forward with this because we both believe that race isn't something that white folks should talk about only when people of color are around. We should not be dependent upon people of color to educate us about cultural differences when so much has already been shared and discussed and published. We need to be using the information that's already available to improve our own cultural competency. And we need to have these kinds of conversations amongst ourselves with other white educators for the purpose of supporting each other and being able to show up authentically and avoid doing harm as we work with student populations that are different from our own. Although Sara's particular situation is working in an all-Black school, I think you'll find this conversation applies to anyone who teaches a student population that is culturally, racially, or perhaps even socio-economically different than your own. Listen in. So you've identified 5 things that you learned, and I'll just share them out, and I'll give you time to expand on and explain each one. So this first one is, don't be afraid to talk about race. Can you say more about that?
So as a teacher in a Black school, I think that sometimes we are so afraid to name the truths that I am a white teacher. The majority of my students are Black. Um, we use a lot of euphemisms. We might say, I work in a Title I school or I work in an urban school. And that's just a symptom of our fear of admitting or talking about something that as white folks, we generally don't have to face in our lives. And the problem with that is that not talking about it, not naming it, is reinforcing this idea of white people as the default and anything else as different, and also that there's something bad about that difference. Being afraid to talk about ways in which we're different from one another can show kids that maybe we think there's something shameful about that difference. And we miss the data on some of the opportunity gaps that exist. So by not being afraid and not dancing around it, we're making sure that we are accurately accounting for what's going on and just being real about what's going on.
So when you say don't be afraid to talk about race, what does that look like in your daily practice then?
So for me, in my school, my students will maybe name the race of a teacher, right? So saying Ms. So and so is Black, or, me saying, as a white person, this is what I think, but I would love to hear what some other people think, or, um, my experiences as a white person might be different than what you're experiencing. My students also, because I'm in a school with almost no white students, they'll talk more often about colorism and the way that they see that showing up. So talking about, well, she gets away with that because she's light skinned, or, he's a dark skinned boy. Um, and so that's really the reality for them, is that this is something that impacts every moment of their day. They don't not see race. They don't pretend to not see race or color. They see it, and they see that it impacts the way that they are being treated. And so for me, it's very important to name that, just the same way we would name, hey, are our special education students getting in trouble more often than our non-diverse learners? We would name that so that we can see how that's impacting them. And, just the same way with my students, I wouldn't shy away from saying the race. I might say, I really recommend this book. It's by an Asian author. Her experience is this. Just being comfortable with the words, I think, is a good first step. Um, and then also, again, educating ourselves about the ways in which our differences impact how we experience the world. So I suggested a bunch of different resources by authors of color about their experience with white supremacy, their experience moving in the world as a Black person, being criminalized and incarcerated. And I think it's just really important for us to acknowledge that our experiences are different and name that that's because we are white.
I think the educating ourselves piece is so important, because one of the reasons that I think a lot of people are afraid to talk about race is because you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing, and no one wants to offend, especially not when you're dealing with students and families. Like, I think everyone listening to this wants to be, compassionate and inclusive. And I think it can be challenging, because in this process of learning, you are going to make mistakes and you are going to have moments. And I can think back, I taught majority students of color, and sometimes for several years in an almost all Black school. And when I think back now to some of the things that I said, some of the limiting beliefs I had, some of my assumptions that I just sort of absorbed from other white teachers in the school, and from my own prior experience, or my own, stereotypes that had just formed just from existing in the world, that I hadn't unpacked yet. And I look back and I cringe now on some of the things that I said and did. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, I think where you and I are in this journey, it has taken years to get to this place. And I imagine 10 years from now, when I look back, I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I said this thing. And being willing to grow and change. Language changes over time. Our norms change over time. So it's not about having it perfect. It's about growing. When you know better, you do better, taking responsibility for your own cultural competency. And I think responding appropriately when someone tells you something you've done has been offensive. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like this idea of owning it and taking responsibility if you find out that you made a mistake. Because really, I shouldn't even say if, I should say when you say something that didn't come out the way you wanted. How would you handle that situation?
Definitely. I think that, and I'm especially influenced by having read How to Be an Anti-Racist, it's easier to admit when you know that it's not saying that you are a racist person. It's not a noun. It's not that this is who you are. You did something that was racist. You did something that hurt someone else. If you stepped on someone else's toe, you would apologize, even if you didn't do it intentionally. So I think taking it as, this is not that I am a bad person, but this is that I did something that harmed someone else. And so I need to apologize for that harm. I need to make that harm better. And I need to ensure that I'm never going to do that again. Just the same way that we teach our kids, if they push someone in the classroom, you need to apologize. You need to make it right with that one individual, and you need to learn the social emotional skills so that you're not going to do it again. And sometimes we forget that those same steps and skills apply to us as adults and as teachers, and not just to our students who we're working with.
Yeah, exactly. And thinking about it as just like this is another way that we sometimes harm people. We hurt other people's feelings, other people hurt our feelings. Sometimes it's inadvertent. And when we're dealing with racism, we're talking mostly about systemic issues. It's not about people's like heart attitude and do you hate people of other races. We're looking at, as you said in the very beginning, about looking at institutions, about policies, about how different groups of people are impacted. So it's never going to be this judgment of like, oh my gosh, I did this one thing, so that means I'm a racist. That's not
Right.
it at all. To depersonalize it, decenter ourselves, and just learn from that and move on. And I think that really leads into the second point that you had articulated in your post, which is about listening more than you talk.
This one is so important. This one is really, to me, the heart of the intention that I went into writing this blog post, was just that it's not about what I think. It's not actually about my voice, but it is also my responsibility, and it is the responsibility of white educators to teach others about anti-racism, to teach others to do this work, because we can't put all of the burden on people of color. We can't make it their job when they haven't signed up for it, when they're not being compensated for it, to teach us as white teachers how to help our students. So listening more than you talk, to me, means we need to take advantage of the times when people of color, teachers, colleagues, educators, people who have written books and created podcasts and have all of this content out there, have already volunteered their time and their expertise. They're already talking, and it's our job not to ask them to explain things to us, but just to listen to what they're already saying. So our colleagues can be an amazing resource for that. I have so many colleagues who I try to listen to and amplify in staff meetings, in one-on-one conversations. People of color who talk about anti-racism generally on the internet, webinars, all sorts of wonderful content that they put out, educators of color, and then most importantly, listening to our students, because especially myself as a secondary teacher, but also younger kids too, they will tell us who they are. They will tell us what they need. If you listen to your students, if you ask them, they will tell you what their lives look like at home. You don't have to assume that because they come from a certain neighborhood that they are in a single parent household that their life looks a certain way. They will tell you. They will tell you what matters to them, what they think is important, what they think about current events that are going on. They'll tell you how they want to learn, what they think is important for a teacher to do and be. And those are the relationships that we can build, and that we can be responsive to them and who they are. And they'll probably tell us even sometimes when we get things wrong, if we've built up that trust with them, that they feel that they can tell us that something didn't feel right or something felt off in something that we said.
So don't be afraid to talk about race. Listen more than you talk. And the third strategy is to do the internal work.
Mm-hmm. The internal work is really what you had said earlier about, we all get this from the world around us. We all grow up in a culture that is rooted in white supremacy. And so it's inside of us. It's natural that it's inside of us, but we have to fight it. We have to name it when we see it and fight back. So something that I find really useful is if I have that split second thought, that reaction when I see someone on the street and I think about crossing the street, or any situation, especially as a white woman, where I might feel threatened in public spaces, or think about, I see something that is a little bit sketchy to me. Should I call the police? Noticing what that thought is, naming it, and saying, is that true? Or is that an assumption that I'm making based on race, what the person looks like, circumstances? And if I see yes, that was racist. I'm making certain assumptions based on who this person is. Naming to yourself, that's not true. It's okay that I thought that. That's something that I thought because I was taught that this is a bad neighborhood. I was taught that um, tall Black men are scary, but it's not true. And another way that we can combat that is actively seeking out ways to combat that notion. So studies have shown that putting up images of powerful Black men can help students to see that Black men aren't scary, that Black men can be successful, things like that. So actively combating those internal biases that we all have, but with compassion, with saying that this is something that happens to most people who grow up in white supremacist culture, and it does take work to undo. It's not something that you can just turn a switch and be done with it. And it's also important for us to be doing this internal work as it relates to school too, to look at how our pedagogy and our expectations of students might be informed by white supremacy. They might be influenced by the ways that maybe we're expecting more obedience and discipline out of Black students, but encouraging more openness and creativity and questioning in white students. So doing the internal work is really about fighting our own internal biases, but also questioning how is the world around us being impacted by race, and making sure that we know what to do in our own classrooms to make them a welcoming space for students, to make them anti-racist, to make sure that we're serving students by embracing their whole selves.
I think of it as really just part of my own personal development. I'm always trying to be the best version of myself. I'm always trying to unlearn things, that I picked up as a child. Maybe someone didn't even tell me that the world operated in this certain way, or, that I need to behave a certain way, or people, this is how the world should be. But it's just messages I've picked up along the way that I'm like, this is just not serving me. And so I feel like this is an extension of it. And it can be easy to get caught up in this idea that, like, racism is such a heavy topic. And, thinking about, institutional racism is just like, oh man, this is going to be so hard for me to try to understand it. But I feel like I'm always trying to understand gender dynamics, just from growing up in a patriarchal society, and thinking about, what assumptions do I have of my husband just because he's a man? What assumptions does he have of me because I'm a woman? Like, just sort of questioning and figuring out what serves and what doesn't, and listening to the people around you to figure out, like, what are the beliefs that I have internalized that are not helping me to show up the best that I can. And you're so right about bringing that into the classroom and thinking about how that impacts your work there.
Just like as women, we have internalized elements of the patriarchy, and we might even have certain expectations of other women or criticize other women for not being feminine enough, for not acting in certain
Yes.
ways that we've been taught that women should behave. Our Black students also have internal work to do. They also have internalized racism. But for them, the stakes of that are so much higher because it's about their self-esteem and their self-perception. So they also need to challenge their own perceptions and expectations that they have internalized through living in a society that devalues them. And they need us to do that work, especially because we need to be able to be there to support them in building that self-esteem.
There's an important caveat here, which is actually your fourth thing that you learned from teaching in an all Black school, which is to avoid the white savior complex. Can you talk about that?
I think this is one of the most important ones on this list. And this is something that came up with several of my colleagues when I spoke with them about this article, that this has to be coming from a place of calling in white educators to be part of a conversation about how we can improve, and not about making everything about white people. The way that I've seen this in my own teaching is that when I moved from working in a mostly white suburban school to the school that I'm working at now, I got a lot of positive feedback. I got a lot of praise. People told me I was going to be making such a difference, which of
Mm.
course teachers want to make a difference. But also, I certainly hope I made a difference to my students at my previous school because I was their teacher. They were learning. We had a really wonderful relationship. They were learning from the text that I was teaching and also from who I was as a person. And I hope that that's the same at my current school. And the implication, which I don't think a lot of people try to unearth and investigate, is that this idea that I'm going to make a difference is assuming that there is something broken with the Black children and the neighborhoods that I'm teaching in. And that me as a white person coming in, I get to fix them. And that's just not true. I work as a teacher because I love it and because I'm a professional and I have skills. It's hard, but I'm not a hero or a saint for working with Black students any more than I would be for working with any other students. And we see this in students with disabilities as well, in a way that's reinforcing ableism. The idea that certain kids are broken or harder or worse than other kids. And it's never phrased like that. It's always, oh, you're such a hero for working with that population. But that's the implication, is that you would have to be a hero because no one would want to work with that population otherwise, that you have to be something super special. So that for me is what needs to be rejected, right? All teachers are special. All teachers are heroes. All teachers have to have enormous patience to work with children all day, but there's nothing different about these kids. They're kids. I'm trained to teach them, and I'm going to be the best teacher that I can be. And also, I'm not always the best teacher they could possibly have. It would be really great if they had more teachers of color, more women of color, more men of color, more male teachers in general, but I am who's here and I'm going to do my best. But I am not the be all end all, for these kids. They need teachers who look like them and teachers who look different like them in combination in a balanced amount. And if they can't have that, we're going to make sure that they have the best teachers that they can have. So my goal in rejecting the white savior complex is not to make things about me. So as much as possible, if I am looking at what initiatives I think need to be done in my school, what needs to change, or in the communities that I serve, I should be taking the lead as much as possible from people of color. I should be joining their initiatives, supporting their efforts, not trying to act independently and fix the problems that I see all by myself.
What I hear is a lot of humility, you know, and I think that can be the piece. Sometimes it's really hard to identify when a white teacher is having a difficult time establishing relationships and trust and connection with students from a different socioeconomic background, racial background, etc. I think if you see yourself as a hero for coming to this school, like you're in this neighborhood that no one else wants to teach in, and every time you tell people in your neighborhood, in your middle class neighborhood, oh yeah, I teach here, and they're like, oh my gosh, like that's it's so dangerous, or wow, you're really something like that. Wow, you're making such a difference, as you said. I would find 90% of the time when I would tell people what neighborhood I taught in, I would get a response like that from fellow white people. And so having like a ready answer to counter that is important, because not only does it impact how you see yourself, it impacts how you show up for students. And I don't think for a moment that kids can't tell who thinks that they are a hero just for showing up in their school. Like they live there 24/7. You're not a hero for showing up for 6
Right.
hours a day.
Right.
And it's condescending and patronizing to
Mm-hmm.
think of, like this area is so bad, no one would want to teach there. Like they live there. This is their home. This is their community. And so if we see it as this other that is somehow beneath us and we're doing them a favor by being there, that's an arrogance that comes out in interactions. It plays out in power dynamics that can really backfire in relationships with kids. So this mindset that you're articulating here, I think, is so important. And seeing, okay, I'm not even necessarily the best teacher for this job. That right alone, I think, is humbling, to think like I'm not better just because I chose to come here, and that it's really my responsibility to listen to the people who live here, listen to the people whose community this is, and model myself around what they want and need and think and feel, instead of like assuming that whatever I'm bringing in from the outside is inherently superior. And that is an unlearning. I can tell you, I did not think that way at the beginning of my teaching career. I totally saw myself as a hero. Like I felt like it was a more important teaching job than teaching, in the community that I lived in. And looking back now, I'm positive that impacted my relationships with students. So I think if we can prevent someone else from having that problem, that would make me so happy to illuminate this, because I would have benefited so much from this conversation earlier.
I definitely feel that, especially in terms of the safety thing. I mentioned in the blog post an anecdote of many family and friends being really concerned about me taking public transportation to my
Mm.
job because it was in such a dangerous neighborhood. And a friend, completely unrelated, had posted the map of subway stations by reported crime numbers. And I lived near a particularly busy subway station in a white middle upper class neighborhood. And our subway stop had more crimes reported per year than the one at my school. And that was an assumption that I was holding, that other people were holding. And it wasn't even true, right? It wasn't even true that it was so dangerous for me to be going down to this stop. And as you said, our students live there all of the time. I get to go on the subway as a white woman, and mostly I don't get bothered because people can tell that I'm out of place. People can tell that I'm coming in here for a certain job, that I'm coming in here to teach. But my students, who are young women of color, get on these buses and trains all of the time, and they are concerned for themselves, and they are concerned for their safety, and that's their life. They don't get to leave at 3:30. They have to be there at 8 when it's dark. So thinking of ourselves as we're making such a sacrifice, if the public transit system isn't safe enough for us, then it isn't safe enough for them, and we need to do something about that. Um, if
That's
these
right.
neighborhoods are so bad, then maybe we need to go into them and question our assumptions and see all of the really wonderful things that exist, the community gardens and playgrounds. And yes, there are definitely issues and violence, but also that these are people's homes and that they're taking good care of them and that they're doing their best to provide for their community and create a space that they can love being in.
What kind of response do you give when someone from your socioeconomic class or from your racial background makes a comment? They find out where you teach, what you teach, the
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood, what you do, and they paint you as this hero, savior, martyr. How do you normally respond to that, especially if it's someone you don't necessarily know well?
Mm-hmm. I don't have a great answer for it yet. That's something that I'm still trying to work on. I'm not doing something that's that hard. I get on a train, I do my job, I come home. They are living in communities that are over policed. They're living in communities that have issues with violence, that are under resourced, where they might not have a grocery store near them, where they might go straight from school to then have to go to work from 4 to midnight. It's not actually about me. And what I'm doing there is not going to change that.
I found sometimes that it helps to ask questions and kind of pose it back to the person. So you're like, wow, oh my gosh, you teach there, aren't you scared? And I'm just like, oh, why would you say that? What do you mean? And then it causes them to realize, oh, okay, if I really articulate what I'm getting at with this, that's going to sound super offensive. And they'll kind
Mm-hmm.
of back off of it and kind of realize it for themselves. And that's worked well for me in a lot of different situations when people say things that are like kind of low key offensive, rather than trying to explain it to them and be like, oh, what do you mean by that? Or I'm not sure I understand. Just real matter of fact, and make them kind of like hear themselves. Normally they'll get it. If they don't get it, if they don't hear themselves at all, that's a different type of personality. That's a person who's a different place in the spectrum of unlearning. We'll put it that way. But I find that most folks will kind of walk it back a little bit and think like, yeah, what exactly did I mean by that when I implied that this was, a horrible job that no one would want, and that I'm just an
Mm-hmm.
amazing person for even deigning to go in that neighborhood. Why?
Yeah.
Why? I think those kids are amazing. We have so much fun, and they're learning this, and I
Right.
love this about them. Oh, interesting that you would think that that would be not a great place to teach.
I had a great conversation with a friend who goes down generally to the area that I teach in, but not quite as far into it for her school. She's getting a PhD, and she commented, oh, when I've been on that train, it starts to get a little bit sketchy after a certain point. And my wife asked her, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, there's people selling loose cigarettes, and my wife kind of just said, I don't buy them.
Mm.
The People selling loose cigarettes on the train isn't hurting me. If I don't want a cigarette, I just don't have to buy them, and kind of this, if someone's sleeping on the train, I sit somewhere else. So I like that idea of asking people, what do you mean by that? And then if they are articulating these kinds of things that are markers for something else, that are standing in for a different concern, just saying, that's fine. I don't have to worry about that. Doesn't affect me.
Yeah, I think that really challenges people's norms and assumptions without being attacking them or forcing them to go someplace that they're not quite ready to go in. Because normally these kinds of conversations are very offhand. Just like that example about, the train being sketchy after a certain hour. That was an offhanded comment. She probably didn't think twice about it until your wife responded the way that she did and made her think, oh yeah, what exactly did I mean by that? And is that really what I want to be saying? So great example. The final thing you said that you learned from teaching in an all Black school was that it's important to be authentic. Let's talk about that.
I've learned this lesson from so many different people that I work with, from white teachers and from Black teachers. But I think that there is this initial impulse, often from young white teachers, who feel like they have to like hip hop, they have to like basketball, they have to kind of pretend to be into these things that we just immediately associate with Black students, because that's how you're going to relate to them. And first of all, our assumption that our students all enjoy those things is based on stereotypes. And so the first step of being authentic is getting to know each child as an individual, because we're using stereotypes to try to fill in those gaps of what we don't know about them. If you know a ton about them, you don't have to fill in those gaps. Johnny really likes to read horror stories, and Alyssa is into drawing, and Charisse has a beautiful singing voice. Like, you don't need to make assumptions if you know who they are, if you know what they really like. And students really would rather just not see us be fake, even if they do like hip hop or sports or skateboarding. They don't want us to pretend to like those things in order to relate to them. They want us to show interest in those things. They want us to listen when they want to talk about those things, and for us to support them, for us to go to their events, their sports games, you know, support their YouTube channel. I had a student send me, once she started a singing YouTube, and that's the authentic engagement with what they like without pretending to be someone that you're not. And then we can put our energy in being authentically who we are. So if you like country music, play country music. My co-teacher does that all of the time. If you like gardening and houseplants, share that with your students. I have so many students who have come up to my plants in the classroom and said, can I help water this? Can I help take care of this? That's not something that we stereotypically associate with Black students, but it's what I'm interested in. And the ones who were exposed to it and who already liked it, or who were exposed to it and had never been before but thought it was cool, they wanted to talk to me about it. They were interested in it. And I think even better, although this requires definitely a level of vulnerability, is focusing on those deeper elements of identity. So if you are a queer person, if you are a person with a disability, if you are part of a military family, those deeper elements of identity, those things that are really important to you, you also have students who that is really important to them. And that's something that we can share with our students that will make them feel seen. They hopefully will have other teachers who share the same racial background as them, who come from the same neighborhood as them, but you can be that first male teacher that they've ever had in the 9th or 10th grade. You can be the first openly queer teacher you had, especially if you teach students with disabilities. You can say, I struggled with reading as a kid too, right? And connecting with them on those elements of their identity that they don't necessarily often see reflected in adults, so that they can feel like, wow, I can be this and I can be successful.
And making sure that it's true to who you are. I just love that point. And I mean, I can tell from your energy, and we're recording this in video too, so we can see each other. I can tell you're like a low key kind of chill person, like I am. You're not the dancing on tables type of teachers.
No, and
Good.
I used to get feedback about
Uh-huh.
that. I used to be told like I didn't have enough energy, that I was too monotone. And that is something that I've worked on in terms of trying to show my excitement in a way that comes across to students. but also I don't have to be somebody that I'm not, right?
That's right.
I'm serious, I'm academic, this is me. And for students who connect to that, that's great. And then, for students who don't, I do my best to engage them academically, but maybe I'm not that teacher who is so similar to them. And there are other teachers for whom dancing on the table is their thing.
That's right. And that goes back to the savior complex. You don't have to be everything to every student. Like
Mm-hmm.
some kids are just going to connect with you more. Some kids are going to connect more with a different teacher they have. There's different adults in the school for kids to connect with. You don't have to be all things to all people. And I think being who you are is just so important. You do not have to match the kids' energy. If they are loud and boisterous, or their cultural norms are, sort of like talking over each other, and your cultural norms are, interrupting is rude, you don't have to match that. You can respect where they're at, but you don't have to suddenly become like this loud kind of person if you're not that. I mean, I'm a very chill person too. And I like to think that that has a calming effect, which is really nice for certain personality types. Certain kids
Mm-hmm.
really thrive off of that, because there are some teachers who their teaching style is getting kids hyped up, like, let's get excited. Yeah, we're going to learn this. So to come into my room and it's like the lights are down low, we got plants everywhere, we got soft jazz playing, and I'm just kind of like, okay, here's what we're doing today. That's a nice vibe too. And so I think it's really important not to rely on, as you were saying, our stereotypes of what this community is like and trying to mimic what we think they want when it's just not us. It's going to register as false. And I think especially with older students, they're going to see right through that. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, Sarah, this has been so helpful. I'm wondering if you can wrap up with something really important that you want teachers to take away from this. If there's something that you want them to remember in the week ahead, just as they think about their own work and their own role in the school, what's something you'd like for every teacher to know about this topic?
I want every teacher to think about this as a journey. It's not one point that you need to get to. It is a journey now, and it's always going to be a journey. It's never going to stop being something that you have to put work into. So we talked about being the person who maybe pushes back when someone asks a question or makes an assumption. And we also talked about being the person who's challenging your own inner assumptions. And you can and should be doing both at the same time. So you can still be having that, should I clutch my purse or move away from this person in the elevator thought? And you can be the person who pushes back when somebody else says something that could be offensive, that is reinforcing the narrative of the white savior. So we have to be working on ourselves and working on other people at the same time, because it's a journey and we're never going to get wholly done with one step in order to then go on to the next step. We have to be willing to be imperfect and then be working with other people who are also imperfect.